So we talked about how AI needs to be situated in a human system. That reminds me of a lot of discussions on LinkedIn, on everywhere, how, for example, user research does not need users anymore. The whole idea of synthetic data, that we can have bot participants GPT answering questions so that we don't really need to do research anymore. That's a very intriguing development. We definitely have opinions about that, but it's just a brand new data source. So let's maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And I think this one's been kind of particularly controversial. I must admit, even when I first heard it, I was initially like super skeptical. But after letting it mull over a little bit, I think I'm more open to the idea. For me, it's really about understanding that different types of data and different types of insight sources, they each have their own place. And we just need to understand what are the limitations and strengths of each one, and when it's appropriate to use one, when it's appropriate to use a combination, etc.
Yeah, I agree with you. I remember the first time I thought I read a paper, an academic paper by at least someone from Harvard. I was totally shocked. I thought people from Harvard would devote their attention to create synthetic data. I thought that was very, very surprising. Like you said, I over time I feel like yeah, this is just a different data source. It's really about how we use it. It takes a little bit of time to overcome that skepticism, but I've been also reflecting on what has happened to change at least my personal opinion about it. So why are we now becoming a little bit more comfortable with it? I'm trying to understand that. I don't think I have a very good perspective on that yet.
Yeah, at least for me, like I think a big part of it is just understanding that it's not, it's not one or the other. We're not going to totally switch over to just using synthetic respondent, and then that's what market research is from now on. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think there is some awareness, certainly amongst the people that are building these synthetic respondent solutions. There's still that awareness that the human has to be part of that. There is the appropriate place, maybe we can do some exploratory hypothesis testing to see if if something even makes sense in the first place, to see what kind of potential things people might say in response to an idea. But then to really validate that, then you really need to talk to real humans, for example. There's also, like, I think there are a lot of valid concerns with the idea of synthetic respondents. So part of it is, you mentioned that it's like kind of new data. It is and it isn't, in the sense that large language models they're probabilistic based on all of the training data that they've seen. And so in a sense, it's kind of large language models are to a certain extent recycling all the data that they've been trained on. And, there are some concerns, like, for example, people have been saying, well, large language models that have been trained a year ago, they can't make any sense of topics that are just recently coming to the fore. And I think that's not necessarily the case. It depends on the methodology that's being used. There's no such thing as just synthetic respondents. There's different methodologies. And so, for example, if you have a large language model and you feed it new articles, in the last few months, large language models have the capacity for in-context learning. So they can make sense of those articles. They can sort of use all the training, that material that they've been trained on, and use that to make sense of these new things. And so it's not like we're just totally recycling old data.
Okay, so what you have said, actually, there are two things that I'm hearing. One is we use this approach to test, like we build a questionnaire, we use synthetic responses to test if our questionnaire is well built. In that situation, we basically don't use the data. We use it as just to test. Once we're happy with the questionnaire, basically based on this approach, we can launch the questionnaire using real human participants. So that I can see that I'm totally comfortable with. I think that can be very helpful. But the second part that you said, that actually is about using synthetic data. The synthetic data can actually be valuable. So I think this probably takes a little bit more for people to really embrace that. Are there, how would you describe the pros and cons of actually using the data without any I wouldn't say real human input, because the data is based on real human input, but at least not human input specifically to address the research objectives?
Yeah, I guess for me, like it really comes down to being much more transparent. So there's this idea, like of insight provenance. And so we can think about there are many, many different types of sources of how we derive insights. And some of them could be coming from real humans, talking to people, having in-depth conversations with them. Some of them could be more of a mixture. Maybe there are cases where it makes sense to first test an idea with whether generate possible opinions with synthetic respondents, and then to actually test those ideas and ask real people about those. So in that case, the insight provenance would sort of be a mixture of synthetic with real humans. So if the question is sort of, is there room for insights that are purely coming from synthetic sources? That part, I guess I'm not so sure about. For me, it's most important that wherever the insights are coming from, it needs to be made crystal clear to the researchers that are making use of that. And to a certain extent, it comes down to judgment. If they think that there is room where we need to have real humans in that conversation, then at least it should be totally clear to them that whether the insights or the data is coming from real humans or not.
Okay, so insight provenance, I really like that. It sounds like it comes from data provenance. If that is the case, I think because data provenance has been around for quite a while, maybe can you explain a little bit more about data provenance, the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, sure. And data provenance is really just the idea of understanding where your data is coming from, where it originated from. So it is related to the word data governance, and there's sort of slight nuances between the two terms. But really, it comes down to understanding where data has come from, what happened to it along the way. So, for example, even within our own systems, we ask real humans their answers. They give us open-ended responses. And then we might process that in certain ways. So, for example, we might do machine translation to translate it into English. We might try to automatically code it, or we might, more traditionally, we might ask a human to code it. Regardless, there's a process by which the data has originated and then is being transformed in a variety of ways. And so data governance and data provenance is really just kind of making that explicit and showing for any piece of data that you're looking at, being able to have sort of that chain to say, okay, where did this data come from and what's happened to it?
Okay, so yeah, that's very helpful. So basically what you're saying is with insight provenance, what needs to happen is the whole process, you're very clear where AI plays a role so that you know where you should direct your attention on. So if you know that this part probably is synthetic data, you should probably think about whether you should rely on the data, or at least when you use the information, you're fully aware of the potential limitations of it, and then you can decide how you use it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a responsibility both in terms of the technologists that are building the technology that's providing this in the first place, as well as the market researchers that are then making use of it. Like, I think both sides need to be sort of more transparent. The researchers need to have that accountability in terms of maintaining that data governance to say, if you're showing something to an end client and they ask you, how did you derive this insight? You should be able to answer that. And likewise, the companies that are maybe producing synthetic respondents or whatever other synthetic data, they need to be clear about what are the potential limitations, what are some of the pros and cons, but I think mostly with the limitations.